Hey guys, I'm Georgia and welcome back for another episode in my history series, where today I have another historical medical story to share with you all. I don't know about you, but these stories are my absolute favourite to research. Medical history is just so fascinating. In the past, I've covered cholera and how Jon Snow managed to put an end to the London epidemic, the Spanish influenza, the 80s AIDS epidemic, Typhoid Mary, the thalidomide scandal, London's Great Plague of 1665, and so many more. I'll leave a whole playlist down below of my medical histories just in case you find this one interesting. But today's piece of history is very much not one for the faint-hearted or the squeamish, because we're talking about hookworms, a parasite, and how a zoologist called Charles Stiles discovered an epidemic of infestations in the American South. He brought awareness to the side effects of hookworm and changed the world for good. Stiles isn't a man you've probably ever heard of before, but if you live in the American South and you don't have hookworm, well, you probably have him to thank. As always with my medical videos, let's begin by taking a look at what hookworm actually is. And just in case it needs saying, I'm obviously not a medical professional, I'm just a nerd. Hookworms are parasitic roundworms of which 3 different species can live in the intestine of infected humans, their hook-like heads attaching to the intestinal walls, hence the name. Each worm can be anywhere from 5mm to 13mm long, and you can have hundreds of these little guys living in your intestine at any one time. And they can live over 2 years in the right conditions. Feeling funny yet? I did warn you. Hookworms are not transmitted from person to person or animal to animal because of course hookworm is also pretty common in pets, cats, dogs and other animals. Hookworm is actually transmitted through soil, or more specifically, soil featuring human feces. In the feces of a human infected with hookworm, there will be hundreds of tiny little eggs. Now, this isn't really a problem if you're doing your business in a toilet. It will just travel through the sewage system, get cleaned and filtered out, and hopefully no one will get infected along the way. The big problem with hookworm comes in areas with less access to sanitation systems. Hookworm is generally found in less privileged areas where people defecate outdoors, although it can also be through animal feces as well. When that happens and infected humans or animals defecate on the ground, the hookworm eggs are obviously released into the ground, and when hatched, the larvae work their way into the soil, and from there they just wait, maturing. The next issue comes when people go wandering around outside without their shoes on, whether it's kids just being sent out to play barefoot, or if it's in an area in which people maybe can't afford proper shoes. Again, the issue of privilege and wealth, or lack of, comes up. But it's through these bare feet that the hookworm larvae work their way into the body. They're perfectly formed to enter through the skin, usually on the bottom of your feet, but it could be pretty much any part of your skin that's touching the infected ground. And from there, they travel through your bloodstream until they reach your lungs. Then you cough them out of your lung and then swallow them back down without even realising what you're doing. Soon they reach the small intestine where the little hookworm larvae make themselves at home and grow into adult hookworms. As I mentioned before, they can live there for up to 2 years before eventually passing through your feces, and then the cycle continues. So, how do you know that you have hookworm? What are the symptoms? Well, you're probably going to hate to hear this, but the majority of people don't really have any symptoms if they're otherwise generally healthy. However, if you are one of the people who get symptoms, when you're first infected you might get a small itchy rash at the location where the hookworm larvae entered your skin, but other than that, there's not a huge amount of signs. Maybe you might get some diarrhea when the hookworm eventually reaches your intestine. Other symptoms that could pop up over the course of the infection can be abdominal pain, colic, intestinal cramps, nausea, a fever, blood in your stool, loss of appetite, and brain fog. If you're infected for a really long time, you might eventually become anemic thanks to the worms feasting on your blood. Anemia can cause you to become lethargic, fatigued, faint and breathless, and in more severe cases can even cause something called geophagia, an intense craving to eat dirt. As you can imagine, that craving to eat dirt doesn't really help with the hookworm infection. You're probably just ingesting more larvae. In the most serious of cases, anemia could lead to heart failure. And if it's your first time being infected, your symptoms might be worse than others, but honestly, most people wouldn't really have a clue they're infected, especially in the early days for adults. Children may experience slightly worse side effects as a result of their infections, as it has been found that hookworm infection can lead to malnutrition because they're essentially sucking all of the goodness out of your blood. I mean, not quite, but enough. And as a result of that, you can have stunted growth, both physically and intellectually. Worldwide today, hookworm infections are associated with the highest global burden of disease. Although the infection isn't deadly per se, it has a huge impact on both health and the economy. In 2016, it's estimated that the disease caused an estimated loss of 2.2 disability-adjusted life years, a measurement of time adjusted to combine years of life lost due to premature mortality and years of life lost due to time lived in states of less than full health, or years of healthy life lost due to disability. So one disability-adjusted life year represents the loss of the equivalent of one full year of health. And then total productivity losses range from $7.5 billion to $138.9 billion annually, depending on which calculation you use. Yeah, that number does vary a lot. This is interesting though, because hookworm isn't something you hear of too often. I mean, maybe people just don't like to talk about parasites, it's not exactly a fashionable disease, but its burden on the world is much higher than other diseases, which gain much more attention. The most affected countries tend to be those with warm, moist climates, so good news to those of us in the UK, it's really uncommon here, to the point that the NHS website doesn't even have a page on hookworm. But if you're in Africa, Southeast Asia, the Western Pacific, Latin America and the Mediterranean, I'm afraid that hookworm is much more common, although I'm sure you already know that. The good news though is that it's preventable and treatable if you have access to treatment. If diagnosed, you'll be prescribed either albendazole or mebendazole, which is a medication that's taken just once to treat the infection, and the doctor might throw in an iron supplement as well, just in case you have anemia. Some developing countries practice preventative treatment. Basically, it's easier just to treat everyone just in case, rather than let the cycle of hookworm begin. Groups of people who are at higher risk of having infections can be treated regardless, like young children, women of childbearing age, pregnant women, women who are lactating, and just generally an adult working in an occupation that puts them at risk for heavy infections. But of course, preventing the disease does go deeper than that. You see huge reductions in infections simply by improving sanitation, better sewage disposal systems, and reducing the frequency of outdoor human defecation. That sounds like it should be simple enough, but there are so many countries around the world where basic sanitation is still seen as a privilege. It's not accessible to so many of the poorest people. So instead of that, it's simply encouraged that people wear shoes when walking outdoors, that they drink safe water, properly clean and cook food, and practice proper hand washing. But even then, those are all incredibly simple things that can be difficult. What if you don't have access to safe, clean water? You can't properly wash your hands or your food. What if you can't afford shoes? As you can see, it's not an easy fix. You might be surprised to find that one of the places historically most affected by hookworm was actually the American South. And this is where today's video gets really interesting, if all the medical stuff wasn't for you. For 3 centuries, up until as recently as like the 1960s, the hookworm was an ever-present threat in the American southern states. The American South has always had a bit of an undeniable stereotype surrounding it, the redneck stereotype, working class white people from the southern US, who are usually considered to be less educated, a bit stupid. That slow southern drawl often thought to be synonymous with the idea of the lazy southerner. And I don't say any of this to offend anyone, we're talking stereotypes here, whether they're true or not, but this is very important context for the rest of the video. Historically, why has all of this been the case? Why is this a stereotype? Why are Southerners historically considered to be slower, less educated, and lazier? A lot of the time stereotypes are just that, they're stereotypes. But what if there is some truth behind it and a reason behind this being the case? You can probably guess where I'm going with this. Hookworm. Hookworm might be the reason, or maybe one of the reasons. If you've been paying attention, you can probably already tell me why. One of the biggest side effects of hookworm is anemia, resulting in lethargy, fatigue, a generally slow brain. I know a lot of you would have had anemia before, I know I struggle with it, and I can attest. These are all genuine symptoms I struggled with for a long time before I was diagnosed, and even afterwards. It's not much of an easy fix. The American South also holds the perfect climate for hookworm to thrive: humid, moist ground, hot weather. And according to the US Census Bureau, even today there is a 16% higher poverty rate in the South than in the North. And this is a disparity which is clear throughout history. The South has always struggled more with poverty. This means that people living in certain areas of the South haven't always had access to working sanitation systems and medical care, and importantly, education, that many other parts of the country may have had. But we're looking at sort of the 18th and early 19th century here, and even earlier. With a lack of plumbing in rural areas at this time, people would have had no choice than to go to toilet outdoors in nature, and there the hookworm cycle would begin. People also couldn't afford shoes, or parents would choose to send their kids out to play barefoot, and the hookworm larvae, thriving in the moist ground, would penetrate the bodies, usually through the soft tissue between the toes of children. With little knowledge of the parasite, the children would never get treated. Most people would never even know they had it, and this would have a massive effect on them as they grew. All of the nutrients that should have been going towards the children's growth would go towards the hookworms, and a huge amount of infected children would only ever reach about 3/4 of a normal body weight and height. Then they would have their own children who they would send out barefoot to play, and the cycle would continue. The parasite infestation would sap their energy and their brain power, giving them thick brain fog, keeping the uneducated uneducated, and the poor poor generation after generation, unable to get out of poverty, giving no end to the cycle. A 1926 study of school children in Alabama found that the more worms a student had, the lower their IQ. But of course, no one in the 19th century or earlier knew this was the reason. They were just lazy Southerners. It's estimated that up to 40% of people from southeastern Texas all the way to West Virginia suffered with hookworm infestations. This literally stopped development in the States. Hookworm didn't only occur in areas of poverty, it also caused poverty. And this is where a man called Charles Wardell Stiles joins our story. He was born in Spring Valley, New York on the 15th of May 1867 and grew up to attend Wesleyan College before going to the College of France and the University of Berlin, eventually getting his PhD. His area of interest was zoology, and he was appointed zoologist and scientific assistant in charge of the Bureau of Animal Industry Zoological Laboratory back in the USA in 1881, where his early research focused mostly on the intestinal parasites of cattle and poultry. In 1892, Stiles and a colleague, Albert Hassel, began to compile the Index Catalogue of Medical and Veterinary Zoology, a compendium on the world's literature on parasites. From 1898 to 1899, Stiles was assigned to the United States Embassy in Berlin to investigate a claim Germany was making that its people was being infected with trichinosis from American pork. Stiles found that this wasn't really true. Safe to say that this guy was a parasite expert. After his trip to Germany, Stiles returned home and resumed his research, deciding now to focus on hookworms, specifically human hookworm disease. And that's where our stories merge. There had been suspicions for a few years at this point that the reason for the laziness in the South was actually chronic anemia that was widespread throughout the States. The main indicator of this anemia was the fact that it had been noted that people had been eating dirt, the geophagia I mentioned earlier. For many years it was thought that these people ate dirt on purpose to make themselves sick and get out of work. But what if that wasn't it at all? Whilst working for the Department of Agriculture in an effort to help farmers keep their animals healthy and parasite-free, Stiles identified a new species of hookworm called Nectar americanus, translated to American murderer. He found these through samples brought from Puerto Rico by a student of his. Eventually, Stiles started to make connections between the effect that this hookworm had on animals and the problem in the South. Stiles was like a dog with a bone. He became convinced that the South was riddled with this particular species of hookworm, and of course everyone else just thought he was a little bit crazy. Medical recognition of hookworm disease had first started in 1843 after an Italian physician reported 20 cases of intestinal worms in 100 different autopsies, and by the mid-1870s parasitic worms had been linked to severe anemia, pallor and weakness. So what Stiles was suggesting about people being affected by hookworms in general wasn't brand new information, but it was crazy of him to think that it was affecting the whole of the South, and that was the reason for their laziness. People didn't want to believe it. I think there was probably quite a bit of classism at play, to be honest. Throughout the 1890s, cases of hookworm disease in humans had popped up in America in St. Louis, Missouri, Buffalo, New York, Texas, and New Orleans, Louisiana. This was ignored by everyone apart from Stiles, who made it his mission to prove that his hypothesis was correct. It was just an idea he had, but he was going to follow it through to the end. But first, he had to convince his employer, the Department of Agriculture, that this was a good use of their time and money. And it's safe to say that Stiles wasn't exactly the most likeable guy. People didn't really want to help him out. As John Ettling, the author of the book The Germ of Laziness, said, he was an interesting guy, but testy and hard to like. He didn't suffer fools. Eventually, by 1902, Stiles was a professor of zoology in the Public Health Service and finally got his approval to travel through the South and see what he could do. In the South, he spent the majority of his time just collecting stool samples of people, a pretty shitty job. Of course, these stool samples quickly showed what Stiles had suspected. These people were riddled with hookworm. But even once he confirmed that this was a big problem, local doctors still wouldn't listen to him. He wasn't actually a doctor for people, he was a zoologist. He looked at parasites and animals. Why would a person doctor listen to essentially what was a glorified vet? Stiles reached brick wall after brick wall and so eventually returned back to his home in Washington to write a paper on the disease. He wrote that hookworm was devastating the South and was even the cause of even some of the proverbial laziness of the poorer classes of the white population. Soon, the newspapers heard of this story and thought it was interesting. The germ of laziness was soon making front page news, but it was more of a mocking tone than actually helpful trying to spread the word, and people in the South were just offended. You don't want to be told that the reason you're lazy was because you had worms. It was embarrassing. You didn't want to be told you were lazy in the first place and not performing as well as the people in the North, especially as all of this wasn't long off the back of the Civil War and rivalry was still really strong. But Stiles was undeterred in his mission to raise awareness, and he spoke about it whenever he could. He knew that hookworm was relatively easy to cure and prevent, that this was a problem that could be solved if only people paid attention. He proposed that the infected should take a drug called thymol and use Epsom salts to reduce the protective mucus shielding the worms in the intestine. Stiles spent the whole of the 1890s trying to convince people of the problem, but doctors in the South consistently downplayed the issue. And even in 1903, a public health manuscript was returned to him with advice to delete a section on privies, private toilets, because it was exceedingly undignified, in fact disgusting, and had no place in a scientific article on public health. People didn't want to listen, and even if they did, Stiles needed a lot of funding to make his dreams of eradicating hookworm a reality. Congress refused to provide this funding, of course, and so he turned to the General Education Board, which had been created in 1903 by John D. Rockefeller to improve education in general, but specifically Southern education. Rockefeller and Stiles were two men from different worlds on the same mission. Unsurprisingly, Rockefeller soon agreed to provide the funding he needed. In 1909, Rockefeller donated $1 million to create the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission for the Eradication of Hookworm disease, and he appointed a Southern man called Wycliffe Rose to run this organisation, and hired Stiles to oversee it all. The Rockefeller Sanitary Commission announced three goals: to survey and map the hookworm prevalence in the South, to treat the infections found, and to eradicate the disease. They covered 11 southern states: Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Kentucky, and Texas. And it was soon found that around 40% of the population was infected. Georgia was the most infected and Virginia was the lowest. The RSC had a lot of work to get done, but they knew they wouldn't be able to do it alone. The states had to agree to back the campaign as well, and that was going to be easier said than done. As I said earlier, the southern states didn't react well to being told that they actually were lazy, and they were lazy because they had worms. They were very suspicious of it all. And northerners kind of thought that this money would be better spent elsewhere, that it wasn't going to make any difference. As a New York Times article from 1909 pointed out, this work involved producing a change of habit on the part of many thousands of people, most of them too ignorant to be anything but intensely conservative and too weak in mind and body to welcome new ideas. And there's no doubt it was going to be hard. The people the Commission were most desperately trying to reach were scattered throughout the most rural, hard-to-reach areas of the states. How were they going to be able to do this? They needed to educate people, but they couldn't reach them. Wycliffe Rose soon set out on his mission. It was anti-hookworm propaganda to the highest of levels. Rose and a number of colleagues travelled across the South, heading to the smallest towns and prepping them with announcements, newspaper articles, visits to school, all to educate them about hookworm. They would show horrifying illustrations of the worms to frighten the children, but they knew it was best to target the children whose concern would sway stubborn parents, rather than go straight to the parents and get doors slammed in their faces. They kind of had to scare the children. Teachers would collect stool samples from the children in school for testing, and it would be found that entire classrooms would be testing positive, which made sense as barely any schools had private privies. After they identified the most infected areas, weeks later, doctors would then turn up on horseback to set up makeshift hookworm clinics to treat the infected. An article on PBS by Rachel Newer speaks of how sometimes these communities were so isolated that the residents still spoke Elizabethan English, dialects generations out of date, and apparently this hookworm clinic day would be the biggest day of the whole year. People would show up at the clinic with potato salad and fried chicken, and some people even asked if they could get married in the clinic tent. That's how out of touch some of these communities were. They just didn't see outside people. And the clinics weren't only there to treat people, but to continue to educate. The doctors would hold presentations about hookworms on the weekends, giving instructions on how to remain sanitary and how to build a proper outhouse to avoid reinfection. They obviously couldn't provide these communities with running water and indoor plumbing, but they could teach them how to conduct sanitary privies, just a place to do their business instead of just outside on the ground. People who tested positive for hookworm would be sent home with Tymal and Epsom salts and strict instructions on how to use them. If you mix these with alcohol or fats or oils, they could actually kill you. In the later years, Tymal would be replaced by carbon tetrachloride, but that was just as lethal really. For people who were suspicious about the existence of hookworms or who just didn't understand, they would be shown hookworms through a microscope as proof. A lot of this really was just about scaring people into understanding, but they did what needed to be done to make a difference. The campaign was huge and it did make a difference to a number of communities, but of course it didn't eradicate hookworm. That was always going to be a huge goal to reach, and there were so many of the most rural communities that they actually couldn't get to. There were a limited amount of RSC workers, only around 180 of them, and millions of people to get through to. I came across a lot of articles as to why RSC failed on their mission, what they should have done, but hindsight is 50-50. They did the best they could with what they had and the relatively limited funding they had. Hookworms are incredibly invasive and they're quick to multiply, with a lifespan of 10 years and a single female capable of laying up to 30,000 eggs in one day. It was always going to be an uphill battle. But it did make southerners aware that hookworm was a problem, even if there was resistance to begin with, and that knowledge would pass on down through the generations. It was a big problem throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, despite the Rockefeller Foundation announcing in 1926 that hookworm disease had almost disappeared. It was less for sure, but it definitely hadn't gone. It's actually only in the past 3 or 4 decades that the hookworm problem has really seemed to come to an end in the American South, with better communication leading to better education and opportunities to even the most rural of areas, and of course improved plumbing systems and sanitation in these hard to reach areas. People don't really have much of a reason to do their business outdoors anymore. By the mid-80s, it really had all but disappeared. Also now, people tend to live in cities thanks to urbanisation, and even the poorest generally have access to shoes and plumbing, and people eat better, which also helps. It is believed that there are still pockets of hookworm infestations in the south today, most likely in the deepest areas of the states with the poorest of people, but that is just speculation. In fact, hookworm is considered so rare now that it's no longer a reportable disease to the Centre for Disease Control. Although stereotypes about the South do still exist, it is definitely lesser. You only really see the lazy redneck character in movies now. The South has grown economically hugely in the past few decades, with some of the best education in the USA available there. Better education means better chances in life, less poverty, and the cycle of hookworms comes to an end. It's no coincidence that this growth has happened after the eradication of hookworm. This isn't the whole story, of course. There are a variety of other factors that contributed towards the slower growth in the south, but hookworm just didn't help. Around the rest of the world, hookworm is still an issue though. 700 million people worldwide are still affected, and is estimated to cause a 43% reduction in future wage earnings in affected areas, being most prevalent in tropical or subtropical environments in poverty-stricken areas of Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and China. Is hookworm the cause of poverty, or is poverty the cause of hookworm? There's no way of knowing. It's not so much a cycle as they go hand in hand. Children with hookworm have shown a 23% drop in school attendance. So in 2001, the World Health Organization adopted a resolution to deworm 75% of all at-risk school children by 2010. It was the largest public health program ever attempted. I actually couldn't find any information on whether they ever reached that goal or not. It's crazy to me that the anti-hookworm movement is so huge, but it's not something I'd ever really heard of before researching this video. Hookworm isn't something papers want to splash across the front page. It's not glamorous, it's just a bit horrible to think about, isn't it? The World Health Organization recommends 400 milligrams of albendazole or 500 milligrams of mebendazole to treat hookworm. They're effective, inexpensive, and easy to administer even by non-medical personnel such as teachers. They're used in millions of people with few and minor side effects, and the World Health Organization actually donates the medicines to the National Ministries of Health in all endemic countries, specifically for the treatment of children in schools. And there is also a vaccine in development currently. From 2000, the Sabin Vaccine Institute launched the Human Hookworm Vaccine Initiative. I've tried to say that a million times, I keep getting it wrong. And as of May 2017, the Baylor College of Medicine and the Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development are continuing this research. The vaccine is aimed to prevent moderate to heavy infection and is intended primarily for preschool and school-aged children living in places where hookworm is endemic. Basically, the vaccine aims to induce neutralizing antibodies that will reduce host blood loss and the number of hookworms that can attach to the gut. It looks like phase 1 trials have begun in the USA, Brazil and Gabon, but any vaccine available to the public is still going to be a number of years away. Despite huge efforts to make the drug available to everyone worldwide, only about half of the children who require deworming actually receive the medication they need, and since 1990, hookworm infection has only decreased by 5%, probably because reinfection is so easy. Unless you can get everyone worm-free with access to proper sanitation, you're just going to get people, kids, reinfected again and again. If you can get people vaccinated, it will stop a huge amount of infection in the first place, so that cycle can never begin. So there you go. I'm sure you never wanted to learn about hookworm, but you clicked on this video, so you only have yourself to blame. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.